Less than a year after his installation, John Paul returned to his native Poland, the first papal trip ever to a communist country.
It was almost impossible for the communist Polish government to tell the Polish people, you can't have a visit from the Pope. They'd have a revolution on their hands if they couldn't see a Polish Pope in Poland.
For communism in Poland, it was the beginning of the end.
Gorbachev said to me, the one big mistake of communism was allowing Pope John Paul II to come to Poland right after he was elected Pope. Because once he came to Poland, it just united the people of Poland.
3 million Poles, twice the population of Warsaw, came out to welcome him home. The city's Victory Square was turned into an open-air cathedral for a papal mass. Among the witnesses was CBS News correspondent Tom Fenton.
It was, most of all, his sermon that the crowd was waiting for. Polish Catholics living under a communist government are used to speaking in code and understanding veiled allusions. They had no trouble understanding the Pope. The sermon was a bold challenge to a government that promotes atheism and discriminates against the Church. Christ, he told the expectant crowd, cannot be excluded from the history of the human race in any time or in any place. That was enough to set off the crowd, and waves of applause rolled across the square. The Pope listened to the deeply emotional response of the huge crowd, himself deeply moved. The crowd sang spontaneously, "We want God in our Polish books. We want God in our Polish schools."
I knew in a moment that everything had changed, that nothing would be the same again.
The visit inspired the Poles to unite against the country's communist regime. Workers created an independent labor movement called Solidarity the following year. At its helm was Lech Wałęsa, a young shipyard electrician. Solidarity staged a strike in Gdansk, site of Poland's biggest shipyard. Soon, the whole nation was rocked by strikes and uprisings. Barely a year after the movement was launched, it had more than 10 million members. In December 1981, the Polish government outlawed Solidarity and imposed martial law. But John Paul II showed his support for the movement by denouncing the false peace of totalitarian regimes in his New Year's address. In St. Peter's Square, crowds cheered his rallying cry for freedom. The Pope returned to Poland next in 1983, when the country was still in the throes of martial law, occupied by its own army. At a time when the hopes of Poland's people were flagging, the Pope's visit renewed their faith in their cause.
I think the moment that most impressed me was a crowd of several 100,000 who all at the same time flashed the V sign. It was stunning. And you knew then that the Poles would never give up, that the communists would never win, and that it was just a matter of time before the whole thing collapsed.
When John Paul returned to Poland in 1987, the landscape had changed dramatically. It would take just one more push from the Pope for the regime to topple altogether. And there was no better place for this than the shipyard city of Gdansk, the birthplace of Solidarity. In his previous trips to Poland, the government refused to let him go there. This time, grudgingly, it relented.
I think they thought they could control it. I think they thought, well, he hasn't been there, he wants to go there, he's pretty well got to go there, we'll just try to keep a lid on it. And so they basically seal off the town. There are roadblocks everywhere. They try to limit the numbers. But out in this field, what was the size of the crowd? 500,000, 1 million, who knows? Bigger than the population of the town. It was almost as if the futility of the Polish state was demonstrated in contrast to the power of the people being expressed at that Mass in advance. The altar had been built in the form of a huge prow of a ship. The shipyard reference was everywhere. This was a pope who always understood the power of imagery, always understood the power of television.
The Pope never referred to the banned labor group directly, but in urging support for the workers, the word he used repeatedly was solidarity.
Za solidarność.
It was all but over for Poland's communist tyranny.
He had the impact of a battering ram on the old regime. He was an amazing person. It was not just the force of his personality, it was his Polishness, it was his Catholicism. He spoke to the Poles like no one else could.
A new round of strikes led Poles directly to the ballot box. In 1989, they held their first freely contested election since World War II. Solidarity won in a landslide. It was a victory for which the Pope claimed only a modest role.
As he said, communism at some point was going to implode on its own accord. He says the tree was rotten, I just gave it a good shake.
The shake he gave in Poland reverberated throughout the Iron Curtain countries. Across the Eastern Bloc, people began asking, if the Poles can rise up, why can't we? The fact is, they could, and they did. It wasn't long before the biggest tree of all fell, as the Soviet flag was lowered at the Kremlin for the last time. In 1998, the Pope tried to give a similar shake to communism's outpost in the Western Hemisphere. He made an unprecedented trip to Cuba, where, unlike the chilly reception he got from Polish officials, he was warmly greeted by Fidel Castro. Castro's atheist government allowed the Pope to hold outdoor masses, the first public masses permitted there in 40 years. Castro hoped for, and got, the Pope's denunciation of the U.S. trade embargo against Cuba, but the Pope also hammered the communist leader to improve his human rights record and loosen the reins on the country's Catholic Church.
I think he wanted to open Cuba up in the way that he opened up Poland. I think he succeeded, and what told me he succeeded was my assignment on the day of the big Mass was to be back in the crowd. And there was a man standing next to me, an older Cuban man, who spoke good English, and he would not say this on camera, but I said, what do you think? And he laughed and he said, I think they, meaning the Cuban government, have made the biggest mistake of their lives in letting him come here. And I said, why do you say that? And he said, because the genie's out of the bottle and they can't put it back.